Japanese martial arts and culture in general have a tradition of binding and tying going back at least 1,000 years. We see records of this for every aspect of life. Certainly all of the garments that were worn involved tying and attachment of belts and tongs and different wraps on them in very specific manners. Clothing was folded in particular ways, stored in particular ways. Votive bundles, sacrificial offerings were wrapped in very specific ways. Rope was used in very meticulous manners to hitch and attach daily items and tools. And certainly when we come to the art of binding a subject, we see a massive amount of variety, particularly around the 1600s when the feudal wars were at their peak. So the technique that I'm showing you here very much comes from a Japanese root. I have encountered it in the Russian martial arts and in other systems. I've encountered it in modern defensive tactics as well, but invariably it was a little bit diluted or misunderstood and often grossly wrong. So I'll be very specific as to why I'm using what I'm using throughout. That being said, I would also like to caution you that the majority of work available in the Japanese martial arts today has been grotesquely diluted and codified and ritualized. And we see a lot of zombie attacks with outstretched arms and people throwing rope over the arm and wrapping it, and whipping and grabbing the feet as the subject just stays placidly there. Take for a moment that rope out of the equation and replace it with a pair of handcuffs. If you have any experience doing honest handcuffing against a resistant subject, you know how hard it is to get on. If you do get that first cuff on, leashing them with that firm metal rim can cause a lot of pain and give you compliance, but it's no guarantee. It still takes a lot of work. If we replace that for a thin rope, the damage and injury factor is generally lower until we start getting into strangulations and other manipulations, which may not necessarily be a responsible use of force for an average law enforcement practitioner. So I want to caution that first and foremost. We are looking at realistic application. That being said, I will teach some knots that are perhaps of more historical value, why certain knots were used. For example, with very important prisoners, sometimes it was considered disrespectful to have knots in the actual attachment of the rope. So there'd be this complex braiding rather than just simple knotting that would cinch it up much, much more immediately. There are other much more simple knots that would be used for the lowest tier or the most dangerous criminals, which would have far higher value and relevance for us today. Also, there's a very large concern for aesthetic in Japanese culture, and so there's this massive emphasis on symmetry. And I will show you the very pure traditional form, but then we're going to mess it all up, and we're going to bastardize it, and we're just going to make it work. If we understand the basic fundamentals of these perfect diamonds and braids, then we can do anything we want to them. So going forward, please be your own best critic. Try the work, understand the work. There's zero harm in understanding traditional work and exploring it for its beauty. But then make sure that you can make it work. As I always say, it's good to have a go-to. We got to know what our go-to arsenal is, but we got to be able to get to that go-to to make it work. So going forward, let's keep it pragmatic. I'm going to start off with a simple introduction on rope and basic knotting, and then we're going to go forward into some of the simpler handcuffs and attaches and knots and restraints and work our way up to the most complex. Enjoy. All right, guys, let's talk tools. For the majority of this download, I will be using so-called Paracord, which is short for, of course, parachute cord. It's often termed as 550 cord. 550 because the minimum breaking strength of Paracord is in the vicinity of 550 pounds. So Paracord will basically come in a variety of colors, but it'll look like this. You will have an internal core made up of many fibers, usually something in the vicinity of about 32 individual strands, to an external sheathing that's over 72 to 76 fibers in the outer sheathing. This internal core will continue to rear its ugly head and will start to fray and come apart if left untreated. So as many of you know, the very first thing we need to do is we need to melt and tie off that tip. So in melting the tip, we need to make sure we don't melt it and still see. For example, if I melt it just a little bit, if you still see the tip of the core showing, it's not sufficiently melted. First and foremost, you need to melt that off all the way until the inside disappears. You got to get rid, in this case, the white has to be covered mostly by black. Secondly, if I leave it just like this, I'm going to have a bubble that's not really attached to the core. So I want to use something like pliers to squish this off while it's drying, and I like to round it. So I'm rounding it a little bit because it'll cool very quickly, but initially, of course, it's too hot for your fingers. And I make a nice spearish little rounded tip. And this assures that that's deeply attached to the core. What often happens, this one had more of a kind of a poorly finished bubble melt that I didn't squeeze down. And so when I move, I can feel the core is independent. And what's going to happen is that'll break off eventually and the core will come out. So first and foremost, you want to make sure you melt it down till you hide the core, and then you want to squeeze it off. Next thing we're going to look at is the most basic knot, the overhand knot. All I'm going to do with this is I'm going to take that length, most of you know this, but I'm just going to wrap it around itself one time. So I'm literally going to have just a simple cross. So again, I'm just as if I'm going around my finger, like that. I'm going to take it around the back and just pull it through. So the most basic knot that anybody can tie, right? The overhand knot. But for the sake of clarity and to make sure we don't leave anyone behind, I want to have an overhand knot, and then I want to push it down right to the end so that it's right on the end of that melted tip, and it's going to give me a little ball, a little stopper. It's going to make it easier to grab. It's going to make sure it doesn't slide through my my sliding knots as easily when I want to not lose track of my tip when I'm threading it through. And as you're going to see later on, that's indispensable. All right, so let's review those from overhead. So the very first one I'm going to do is I'm going to make that bite in the rope. I'm going to wrap the doubled portion around my finger, and then I'm going to pull that rabbit ear, that doubled bite, through. When I pull it taut, this gives me an unmoving fixed loop, and that's important. So that's the one we're going to prefer and we're going to favor because that's not going to come undone inside your clothing. So all I want to do now is, if I want to acquire my equivalent sliding knot with a fixed loop, I'm going to open this up with my fingers, and then I'm going to take the nearest piece of the long portion of the rope and I'm going to feed it through. So I can make that loop as long as I need, or as long as the rope will permit. This is kind of short. And then I see that if I pull down, that will tighten to some degree. Now, if I pull in the direction of the open loop, what will happen is the loop will spin around the subject. So the first thing I have to do is I have to pull against the loop to so-called ratchet the knot. I want to ratchet it tight. And you see that that gives you tremendous leverage and then immediately begins to tighten. So the very first thing we're going to do in many of our knots is we're going to take our fixed loop open like this, feed the nearest portion of the long part of the rope to our fingers, and then pull it through. And that's going to give me a sliding loop that I can then ratchet against the loop to tighten and proceed to snare the hand to all aspects of the body. Now we're going to show you how to reverse lock your rope on the wrist. So we're going to begin again with that simple fixed loop that we had before. We take the nearest aspect of the long portion and we pull it through to get that slidable loop. We're going to place that loop, in this case, over a staff. So I just have a simple dowling here, a Joe staff that I can use. So again, if I pull in the direction of the loop, it will never tighten. So the first thing I need to do is pull it taut and pull it against the loop. And this will make it quite tight. What often happens here is people will then just try to tighten it by wrapping over and over like this. And on a staff, you can see that it just wants to spin. It never really gets secure or tighter. And on the human hand, what will happen is it'll usually dig in the skin a little bit, but it's just going to basically wrap the arm over and over and over again, wasting your rope and not really making it effectively tighter. So instead, what I want to do when I'm pulling that tight, the easiest way to learn that is to take my free hand and turn it thumb down. And I'm then going to grip the rope and flip my hand over so I've made a loop around my fingers. I will open that with my thumb and fingers, place it over the end of the stick, and now what ends up happening when I pull this is I've made a second ratchet right here that will tighten the rope in the opposite way. If I were to just continue gripping it inverse, flipping it over, and threading it, what would end up happening is I would have this very familiar pattern. If you've ever seen or done knitting, I spent a lot of time knitting as a little kid with my grandmother. This is the way you start off on your needle, your first row. So I'm gripping inverse, flipping it over, and literally making this kind of a spine down the back. So I could be very, very regular about it and make that always the same tightness if I wanted to. but this simple skill, this chain hitch, is going to become invaluable when securing the wrist quickly. So I'll show you now what that'll look like on a wrist. I'm going to take that rope, push it through like this. My hand is snared. What I do now is I pull it against the loop to get it ratcheted. My free hand now is going to inverse grip and twist over and then envelop the hand. And so now that second loop is over, and as I tighten, this will now ratchet it in both directions. So that simple action now has made this double ratcheted rope that's very, very hard for me to escape from. And this will allow me to go securely anywhere else on the body.